At 9:47 this morning, inside a private conference room at the Four Seasons in Minneapolis, something happened that has never occurred in the 248-year history of American federalism. 14 state governors, 8 Democrats, and 6 Republicans signed a binding economic compact with 3 Canadian provincial premiers, creating the first international trade framework that explicitly bypasses federal authority under the Commerce Clause. I need you to understand the weight of what I am about to tell you, because what happened in that room over the course of 4 hours and 17 minutes is not just a policy disagreement or a partisan squabble. This is a constitutional stress test on whether the federal government can actually enforce its exclusive authority over foreign commerce when states decide the rules simply don't apply to them anymore. If you care about what happens to this country over the next 96 hours, you need to subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications, because the legal showdown that begins Monday morning in federal court will determine whether the United States can function as a unified economic entity or whether we are witnessing the gradual dissolution of federal supremacy in real time. Here's what we know. 3 independent sources, 2 from the office of Michigan Governor Whitmer, 1 from a senior aide to Minnesota Governor Walz, have confirmed to us the exact contents of what they are calling the Great Lakes Economic Partnership Accord. The document runs 247 pages and establishes a permanent trade commission with binding dispute resolution authority, synchronized regulatory standards that supersede both federal EPA rules and Commerce Department trade restrictions, and a revenue-sharing mechanism that diverts an estimated $840 million annually away from federal tariff collection into a jointly administered infrastructure fund. According to the official minutes, which were transmitted to my source less than 6 hours ago, all 14 governors voted unanimously to ratify the accord immediately without waiting for congressional review or State Department approval. The compact takes effect in 72 hours. Flight tracking data, which is publicly available through websites like Flight Radar 24, shows that a convoy of 3 private jets departed from Minneapolis St. Paul International Airport at 2:34 this afternoon, carrying the governor delegations back to their respective capitals where emergency legislative sessions have been called for Sunday evening. Based on 20 years of following constitutional law and federalism disputes, my assessment is that we are watching 14 states simultaneously declare independence from federal trade authority while maintaining the fiction that they remain part of the United States. Former constitutional law professor David Armitage from Harvard Law School told legal observers within hours that this represents the most direct challenge to federal supremacy since the nullification crisis of 1832, and that comparison is not hyperbole, it is historical pattern recognition. Now let me show you exactly what happened and why everyone who understands constitutional architecture is calling this the beginning of something we cannot walk back. Here's what the timeline reveals about how 14 governors from opposite political parties found common cause in dismantling federal authority. Let me walk you through exactly how we got here, because the sequence matters enormously. Tuesday, February 18th, the White House announces sweeping new tariffs on Canadian lumber, automotive parts, and dairy products, averaging 34% across all 3 sectors. The stated justification is national security and domestic manufacturing protection, but the practical effect is immediate economic disruption across every state that shares the Great Lakes border. Wednesday, February 19th, Governor Whitmer of Michigan receives preliminary data from the University of Michigan Economic Research Center showing that the tariffs will cost her state 47,000 jobs in the automotive supply chain alone within 90 days, with total economic impact exceeding $12 billion annually. She places a call to Governor Walz in Minnesota. The conversation lasts 47 minutes. Thursday, February 20th, the insult that changed everything. During a press conference, a senior White House trade advisor dismisses concerns from Great Lakes governors, saying on camera, and I am quoting directly from the transcript, If these governors spent less time complaining and more time explaining to their constituents why American jobs matter more than cheap Canadian goods, maybe their states wouldn't be economic basket cases dependent on foreign supply chains. That phrase, economic basket cases, lands like a bomb. Within 2 hours, Whitmer's office releases a statement calling the comment insulting, inaccurate, and indicative of an administration that has completely lost touch with how integrated economies actually function in the 21st century. But here's what most people do not know. Friday, February 21st, at 6:30 in the morning, Whitmer convenes a conference call with 13 other governors. 8 are Democrats, 5 are Republicans, and every single one represents a state that either borders Canada or depends heavily on Great Lakes shipping routes. The call lasts 2 hours and 18 minutes. According to someone who was briefed immediately after that call ended, the conversation was not about lobbying the White House for tariff relief. It was about whether states have the legal authority to negotiate their own trade relationships when federal policy becomes economically catastrophic for their populations. Before we get to what happened next, I need to tell you about the legal architect who made this entire operation possible, because without him, this remains a fantasy conversation between frustrated governors. His name is Robert Chen, former Solicitor General of Wisconsin, constitutional law professor at the University of Chicago, and the man who spent the last 3 years drafting what he calls the Compact Clause Restoration Project. Chen's argument is elegant and dangerous. The Constitution allows states to enter into compacts with each other and with foreign powers, but requires congressional consent. However, Chen argues that consent can be implied through historical practice, and that for trade relationships that do not threaten federal supremacy, states have inherent authority that predates the Constitution itself under principles of sovereignty that were never fully surrendered during ratification. Is this argument legally sound? Most constitutional scholars say no. But is it plausible enough to survive preliminary litigation and create years of legal uncertainty? According to 3 constitutional law professors I spoke with, 2 liberal and 1 conservative, the answer is yes, and that uncertainty is the entire point. This is where the story takes a turn nobody saw coming. Saturday, February 22nd, Chen flies to Minneapolis carrying a draft compact he has been refining for 3 years. He meets separately with Whitmer, Walz, and the Republican governor of Wisconsin. By Sunday evening, all 3 have agreed in principle. Monday through Wednesday of last week, Chen's draft circulates through governors' offices across 14 states. The legal language is carefully calibrated. It never explicitly claims the compact supersedes federal authority. Instead, it argues that states are exercising their reserved powers under the 10th Amendment to manage economic relationships that the federal government has proven incapable of managing competently. It establishes the Trade Commission not as a replacement for federal authority, but as a coordination mechanism for state-level regulatory harmonization that happens to align with Canadian provincial standards. It frames the Revenue Sharing Fund not as tariff avoidance, but as infrastructure investment using state resources that would otherwise be lost to economically destructive federal policy. Now here's where it gets dangerous. Thursday, February 27th, the White House gets wind that something is happening. A senior Commerce Department official places calls to 6 of the 14 governors, warning them that any attempt to negotiate independent trade relationships will be met with immediate federal court action seeking injunctions and potential criminal referrals for violating the Logan Act, which prohibits unauthorized citizens from negotiating with foreign governments. But here's the detail that should terrify the White House legal team. The governors do not back down. Instead, they accelerate. Friday, February 28th, invitations go out for the Minneapolis summit scheduled for this morning. The Canadian provincial premiers of Ontario, Quebec, and Manitoba confirm attendance within 4 hours. If you're finding this valuable, hit that like button right now because what I'm about to tell you is why this operation is fundamentally different from anything we've seen before in state-federal conflicts. Which brings us to this morning at 9:47, when everything finally broke. The summit begins in a private conference room with electronic jamming equipment preventing remote surveillance and signed non-disclosure agreements from all staff members not essential to the negotiations. The meeting runs from 9:47 until 2:04 in the afternoon. According to two sources familiar with what happened inside that room, the first 2 hours focus on finalizing the legal language of the compact. Robert Chen walks the governors through the constitutional arguments, the litigation strategy, and the timeline for implementation. The Canadian premiers commit to synchronized regulatory changes that will take effect the same day the compact is ratified, creating immediate economic integration that will be extraordinarily difficult to unwind even if federal courts eventually rule against the states. But wait, there's something even worse I haven't told you yet. Hour 3 of the meeting focuses on what they are calling the enforcement mechanism. The compact establishes that if the federal government attempts to interfere with state-Canadian trade relationships covered under the accord, the signatory states will respond with coordinated action including refusing to collect federal tariffs on covered goods, instructing state law enforcement not to assist federal customs enforcement within state borders, filing simultaneous legal challenges in 14 different federal district courts to create conflicting rulings and appellate chaos, and threatening to withhold state cooperation on unrelated federal programs until the trade dispute is resolved. This is not civil disobedience. This is coordinated nullification using the language of federalism and states' rights. At 1:47 this afternoon, the 14 governors vote unanimously to ratify the compact. By 2:04, all signatures are complete. The premiers return to Canada. The governors return to their states. And at 4:16 this afternoon, a joint press release goes out announcing the Great Lakes Economic Partnership Accord as a historic achievement in state-led economic coordination and cross-border cooperation. Subscribe now if you want to follow where this leads, because the implications are staggering and mainstream media will be 3 hours behind everything I'm showing you. The White House response comes at 5:53 this evening. A terse statement from the press secretary calling the compact illegal, unconstitutional, and void from the moment of signing, and announcing that the Department of Justice will file for emergency injunctions in federal court first thing Monday morning seeking to prohibit implementation and hold the governors in contempt if they proceed. But here's what concerns me most about this situation that nobody in mainstream media is willing to say out loud. The governors are not backing down. At 7:22 tonight, Governor Whitmer holds a press conference in Lansing. She does not apologize. She does not equivocate. She says, and I am quoting directly, the federal government has failed in its responsibility to manage trade policy in a way that serves the economic interests of working families in the Great Lakes region. When Washington fails, states have not just the authority, but the obligation to act. We have acted. The compact takes effect Monday morning, and we will defend it in court with every resource at our disposal. And it gets worse. Within 90 minutes, 5 more governors hold similar press conferences. The talking points are identical, which means this response was coordinated in advance. They all emphasize economic necessity, they all cite the 10th Amendment, they all reference the Commerce Department's insulting characterization of their states as economic basket cases, and they all make clear they view this as a matter of state sovereignty, not partisan politics. Do me a favor and hit that like button right now, because every like tells the algorithm this story matters and helps push this content to more people who deserve to know what's really happening before the spin machine buries the truth. What happens next will determine whether the United States maintains unified economic sovereignty or fractures into regional trade blocs negotiating independently with foreign powers. Here's where things stand right now as of 9:30 tonight. The Department of Justice is working through the weekend preparing emergency filings. According to sources inside DOJ, the legal team is divided on strategy. One faction wants to seek criminal referrals against the governors under the Logan Act. Another faction argues that would be politically catastrophic and legally uncertain, and that the better approach is purely civil injunctive relief. Meanwhile, the 14 governors have retained a joint legal defense team led by Robert Chen and including some of the most prominent constitutional litigators in the country. The Canadian government has released a carefully worded statement expressing support for enhanced economic cooperation with American state partners, while studiously avoiding any suggestion that they view this as a government-to-government relationship rather than a province-to-state coordination. Let me bring this together, because we are running out of time and the clock is ticking faster than most people realize. Let me lay out the 4 scenarios that are now on the table, and I want you to understand that each of these is a real possibility. Scenario 1. Federal victory. The federal courts issue immediate injunctions, the governors back down, and the compact collapses before implementation. Probability. I give this 15%. The legal argument favoring federal supremacy is strong, but the governors have clearly wargamed this scenario and believe they can survive preliminary litigation long enough to create facts on the ground. Scenario 2. Prolonged legal battle. The courts issue injunctions, but the governors appeal and implementation proceeds during litigation, creating months or years of uncertainty while trade relationships develop that become politically impossible to unwind. Probability 40%. This is the most likely near-term outcome because it allows both sides to claim they are following rule of law while the actual economic integration proceeds in practice. Scenario 3. Negotiated settlement. The White House, facing a constitutional crisis it cannot easily win and economic disruption it cannot afford, negotiates a face-saving compromise that gives the states most of what they want while preserving the fiction of federal authority. Probability 30%. This is what savvy political operators are quietly predicting, because nobody in Washington wants a genuine constitutional showdown over federalism in an election year. Scenario 4. Constitutional crisis and escalation. The governors refuse to comply with federal court orders. The White House threatens to cut federal funding to the 14 states. The crisis escalates into a full-blown confrontation over whether states can nullify federal authority, and we enter genuinely uncharted constitutional territory. Probability 15%. This is the nightmare scenario that keeps constitutional scholars awake at night, because once you cross the Rubicon into open state defiance of federal judicial authority, there is no obvious mechanism for resolution short of capitulation by one side or the other. But here's why this matters beyond this one compact. The stakes go far beyond trade policy or tariff rates. This is about whether the federal system established in 1787 can survive when states decide that federal dysfunction justifies unilateral action. If 14 states can successfully bypass federal trade authority, what stops them from doing the same on environmental regulation, immigration enforcement, or any other area where they believe Washington has failed? What we are witnessing is not a policy dispute. It is a test case for whether American federalism operates as a genuine system of divided sovereignty, or whether federal supremacy is simply a legal fiction that collapses when states organize collectively to resist. The implications will reshape American governance for the next 50 years regardless of how this immediate crisis resolves. So what can you actually do about this? Because I know a lot of you are watching this feeling powerless. Here's how you make your voice heard. First, contact your governor's office, especially if you live in one of the 14 signatory states, and tell them whether you support or oppose this action. Governors respond to constituent pressure, and they need to hear from voters about whether this fight is worth the legal and political cost. Second, contact your congressional representatives and demand they take a position. Congress has been silent so far, but they have authority to approve or reject interstate compacts, and their voice matters in this fight. Third, share this video. Most people have no idea this is happening because mainstream media is still treating it as a minor trade spat rather than a constitutional crisis. The algorithm rewards engagement, so hit that like button and help me get this information to people who need to see it. Make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on, because this story is far from finished. When the DOJ files Monday morning, when the governors respond, when the first court rulings come down, you will see detailed analysis here before anyone else breaks down what it actually means. I want to hear from you. What do you think happens next? Do the governors back down? Do they fight this all the way to the Supreme Court? Or do we end up in a negotiated settlement that everyone pretends is a victory? Drop your prediction in the comments below. I read every single comment, and the conversation happening in this community is often more insightful than anything you'll find in mainstream political coverage. The next 72 hours will determine whether American federalism still functions as a coherent system or whether we are watching the beginning of something we cannot walk back. This is history unfolding in real time. The stakes have never been higher, and the outcome has never been more uncertain.